So now we're going to get into the best panel of this whole day. So just want to let you guys know, you guys made it. You're going to be wowed. You're going to be thrilled. And it's because we have a great committee and we got a great panelists, and we're going to have a great discussion today. So empowering federal governance, I can't even say the title, the role of open source solutions and data in the federal government. And we're going to go, I'll let the panelists introduce themselves, and I'm going to give them a little curveball, right? We're talking about this in the background. Say who you are, where you're from. Are you a data guy? Are you a solution guy? Are you a policy guy? All right, so I'll start at the end. Let's go back to Josh Campbell.
Hey, you just heard from me. So I'm actually a little bit of everything. Working with Lee Schwartz in the Office of the Geographer, we did a whole bunch of the policy work related to the Geospatial Data Act, and as you saw in that presentation, touch a fair bit of data and a bunch of software.
Good afternoon, everybody. I almost say good morning. Time's flying when you're having geospatial fun. I don't know, some sort of pun like that. But my name is Tom Fitzwater. I'm chief of the Demographic and Economic Studies branch in the Census Bureau's International Program Center. So I'm part of a group that has two lines of work, really. One is research and analysis, and as a data provider of population and demographic statistics of other countries and areas, including our flagship product, which is the international database, census.gov/IDB, of global population estimates and projections. We also provide technical assistance and capacity building to national statistical offices around the world, mostly in lower and middle income countries. This work is funded heavily by USAID. You heard from Carrie Stokes earlier, almost entirely by USAID, I should say. And we've been providing such assistance for over 70 years at this point. Geospatial is an integral part to official statistics. You have to know where you are collecting the data and where the information or where the phenomenon, spatial phenomena are occurring. So the Census Bureau has a large core of geographers in our National Program Center, but also in our geography division who are trying to solve those problems. So I'm excited to be here. Thanks, Aaron.
Hopefully this works. Sounds like it does. Dr. Kirk Waters from NOAA, Office for Coastal Management. I do not have a cool title like Tom does. But I help run the NOAA Digital Coast, and specifically our data access viewer, which provides customized data for elevation, imagery, and land cover data. There's really not a lot more to say to that. I'm going to pass it to Andrew.
I'm Andrew Bulin. I'm the advanced systems developer for USGS NGTalk. I work primarily with the 3D elevation program, handling the LiDAR and raster processing and distribution.
All right, and I'm Aaron Kelly. I'm your moderator for this. I'm the president of Upslope Advisors. And I think I'm the only one wearing a GDAP shirt on. GDAL shirt on right now. So everybody take a look at that bad boy. I actually found out about that at another FedGeoDay. So, you know, and this is great because we have people from different agencies here, and they all do stuff different. And then in this conversation, we're going to learn how they all do stuff, same mission, same open data, but how they do stuff a little bit differently. And so first, we're going to go into audit data sharing, right? How does your government agency use open source geospatial data as authoritative source for decision making? And what strategies are you guys using to manage and secure this data while securing its accessibility to the public? That's a long question, right? So we'll start off the first part. How are you guys using using open source data as authoritative in decision making at your different agencies? I'll start with you, sir. That's very good. Yeah. I could definitely go with you, man.
All right, I can start.
Yeah, go.
So, you know, official statistics are one of the foundational pieces of information for people, places, understanding people, places, and economies, whether it's in the United States or globally. So, you know, I define myself, I say I'm a geographer, but as if you think, what is your niche field? Mine is as an internationally focused National Statistical Office geographer. So inside of that specific subfield of geography, there are so many data considerations, and we are mostly concerned with pulling in data from national statistical offices from around the world. So we are both a compiler of that information to inform our global population estimates and projections. And so you cannot estimate the population of an area if you do not have a basis for that. And that basis are census and survey data, primarily, household survey data. We and other organizations are absolutely reliant on open data that is produced by national statistical offices. So we pull that in, but also from technical assistance perspective, we want to make sure countries themselves are empowered and producing data that can inform local decisions. So that's why we provide, with funding from USAID, technical assistance and capacity building to ensure national statistical offices are producing data or to help guide and consult and share expertise from the U.S. With the local experts.
Yeah, go ahead.
So I struggled a little bit with the concept of open source data. So I'm going to take that to just mean any data that was generated by people outside the government. So I thought about, there are multiple classes of that. One is crowdsourced data, which may be what the question was getting at. But there's also data that comes from grants and data that comes from contracts. And I wouldn't call this open, but there's also licensed data. So we deal with all those kinds of data within NOAA. Some of the examples for crowdsourced data might be anything from the cooperative network of private citizens that have their own weather stations and report that in. And that data gets used in the modeling. You've got things that aren't going to really get much check, such that there's an app for what's called MPing that lets you report to the Weather Service what the precipitation is at the ground level, because they don't have that data otherwise. For grants, we have programs like the Integrated Ocean Observing System that's going to bring in all sorts of water data, buoys, things like that. We have the National Estuarine Research Reserves that are operated through grants and do lots of research, but that data also gets recorded and housed. Lots of data comes in through contracts, so that's more where I deal with things that the elevation data we tend to contract out. Some parts of NOAA also collect it. And then licensing data, I believe the Weather Service has some licensing agreements for weather out there, but not a weather guy. I think that covers.
Yes, I mean, the open data question and the authoritative versus volunteered or non-authoritative angle of this, I think those are terms that are important, but that also cloud and fuzz up any clear thinking on what the sourcing of data means. I would argue that from the crowdsourced geospatial side, I mean, OSM is used widely. Probably 70–80% of it is as a base map. So you're layering something else of importance over the top of it. So is OSM used for decision making? I doubt it. I bet it's a component in providing context around what other data is in there. Now, there's some elements of OSM that get extracted out and get incorporated into other products, and that might drive up decision making a touch. But I would struggle to say that anyone is considering it authoritative, and I would struggle with it thinking that it's actually being used explicitly in a decision-making framework, at least explicitly. But the strategies to implement and manage and secure this data, right? This is the role of OpenStreetMap, because it is so widely used as a base map. The U.S. government, as far as I can tell, is doing very little to persist that ecosystem. And there's really no other commercial or academic data set that we would look at and go, hey, this is of value to us. Let's not put any money into it whatsoever. And I think part of that is probably some policy or some There's some challenging handshakes in terms of like how money moves in the government and how it would go from one place to another that can probably need to be addressed in order to do that. But I'd argue that no other domain of data that's of value is treated like that. In terms of other crowdsourcing data, I mean, Mapillary is one that kind of comes to mind, but I don't know a huge number of people that are doing like ground-based reviews per se. The one that sticks out in my mind, which is not pure play crowdsourced, would be ACLED, which is the Armed Conflict Event Database. And so this is kind of like, this is where the words open source start to mean a whole bunch of different things. So like in the intelligence side, it'd be open source reporting, mean they got it out of a news story. That human beings are distilling and categorizing into quantized data about violent events. That gets used as an overlay, often on OSM, quite a bit. Again, I don't know how much decision-making is done from that. But taking that national security piece just a bit further, I personally look at the Institute for the Strategies of War. If you want to understand granularly what's happening on the Ukraine front, those maps and that data is amazing. I don't really know where they're getting all of that. So maybe that's more in your academic or kind of grant side of things. Anyway, I'll leave it at that.
Okay. I'll come back to that. I kind of like your definition of the open source data, Kirk, so I'm going to run with that. So we receive data from many disparate locations. We get contracted from the government, contracts with states. We get contributed data. And the way we kind of have to handle what goes into our, what I would say, authoritative data source is there's data validation on every single data set that comes in, whether it's contracted or contributed. And then we have different quality levels, data attributes and stuff that will determine whether or not that goes into any derived product. So if we get a contributed data set that's only at 3 meter resolution, then we don't really want to upsample that into our 1 meter resolution data set. So we will make that data available for basically the classification that it qualifies for, but not necessarily any higher resolution data set, and control it through our data validation processes.
Okay. And, you know, that was a good comment about open data. And I had an argument with somebody about a month ago on that, so I do apologize, because I'm like, yeah, I was on the other side of that argument last time. But let's talk about the data that, and I'll define open data for this next question is the data that you make available to the public. So we're talking about the data that you guys make available to the public through data.gov or platform or whatever you guys are using. What do you guys do? Like, what strategies do you use to secure and manage the data while assuring the accessibility to the public? So the data you put out there, what kind of guards do you put on it? How do you decide that this data is going to go out there to the public? What do you guys do on that? So I'm going to, who am I pick on? I can't pick on Tom first. I'll pick on Kurt first, because he's right there.
Okay, so I can answer better for the data that I personally touch.
Yeah, not for all. This is not for all.
Because
No.
yeah, my all no, I can't deal with.
Yeah.
So a lot of the data I touch is very much like the data Andrew touches, and we get in data from the contractors. We want to read through the project reports, the metadata, look at the what it says the accuracy was, how it was measured, all those kinds of things. So we do checks. I mean, that's part of the authoritative part. In terms of securing it, then we've got our copy of it inside our firewall. There's a backup copy out in Azure. It gets then sent to the National Center for Environmental Information for archive. So that's a lot of our process for securing the data and making sure it persists. And determining what's going to go out, there's probably not hard lines on that, but it needs to, at least from our view, look to be useful to the public at large, right? And we don't see huge problems with the data. So it has to have its value. And I think a little of that goes to, what is authoritative? There was an earlier definition in one of the talks. I admit I used ChatGPT to look up what does authoritative data mean. I won't say if it was on my computer at work or not. But, you know, a lot of it went towards, the answer went towards, is it trustworthy? Do you trust that data? And what are the different aspects that makes data trustworthy? And there were a number of them in there. Some of those were the, you know, the accuracies and who's it come from and things like that.
Yeah.
But so we take a lot of that into account for what data is good enough to go out.
Very good. Andrew?
Like you were saying, we do kind of the same process. We're very similar data, but everything that comes in terms of security, we make backups. We have on-site backups of our storage system and a glacier backup of each project, so no concerns with losing any data. And in terms of what goes out, it goes through the data validation process, and almost everything gets delivered at some level or another. Some of it will have to go through an editing process. Some of it will have to go back to contractors. Various cycles and paths that it can take, but then it'll all go out to a duplicated distribution location. That we have one that sits on a website hosted by USGS, and then one that's sitting on an S3 storage.
I'll take a slightly different tack on data security and also crowdsourcing. So the Census Bureau relies on a form of crowdsourcing, which is a survey or a census, and asking everybody, how do you live, or what are the characteristics of your household or you individually, and compiling all of that information and then releasing tabulated results on it. So along that chain, there's two concepts. One is privacy, and the other is confidentiality. In terms of privacy, you have a right for the government not to ask you every conceivable question about your life, or for every single piece of information about your life to be compiled by the government. So that's the right to privacy, or the general right to privacy. And then there's confidentiality of any data that you do provide to the government, or to the Census Bureau specifically, will be protected and disclosure avoided, or so that individual characteristics about you that you wouldn't necessarily want the whole world to know about are not released as part of our public products. So there's been a huge transformation, well, at least from a Census Bureau perspective, it's a huge transformation in the concept of disclosure avoidance leading up to the 2020 census. And it was very controversial from a data user's perspective, because it was the first census that we infused noise into the results that we released, and didn't just do more rudimentary forms of confidentiality protection. So the Census Bureau has very stringent laws, comparable to treatment of classified information, for if any data are unlawfully or unintentionally disclosed, very serious penalties could result for the individuals who inadvertently or intentionally disclosed it. So we as an agency have very much a culture of data security and confidentiality, and that's not just for the U.S. Census Bureau, but that's national statistical offices generally, because in present day, I mean, you've heard this from a polling perspective, response rates are going down. It's getting harder to convince people to respond to surveys, even if it says your response is required by law on the mailer or the postcard that goes out. So in an era of lowering response rates, we want to make sure people, or try to explain to people how seriously we treat data security and protecting respondent information.
So speaking from the boundaries perspective, I'm not a boundaries expert. I'm lucky to work with a team of highly qualified boundary experts, including, I should have mentioned at the beginning, Eric Dornbos is in the room and in the back here, and he is legitimately an expert in what is called the boundary recovery process, right? So there's a few things that you have to kind of think through and understand about boundaries. One, they are typically legal extractions, right? There was a treaty that was made. It was encoded in words. There might be maps that go with it, but there was certainly intent. And so putting that line on the ground must reflect the fact that it was born out of this political process and this contractual process that resulted in a treaty. So boundary analysts are actually the secret sauce in a lot of cases is understanding how to extract that intent. And that's where authority in terms of what was intended here and how are we going to translate that into a geospatial data structure of points, lines, and polygons. As part of the LSI, now the large-scale international boundaries data set is managed by the Department of State on behalf of the U.S. government. It is provided as part of the National Spatial Data Infrastructure and is considered, it is governed under the GDA as a national geospatial data asset. So there's a whole bunch of requirements that we are trying to live up to, as well as just the intent of having the best boundary lines as possible. But as part of the GIS side of once that intent is encoded in a geospatial data structure, there's a bunch of QA/QC that we've developed and routinized to try to make sure that we understand that as, you know, the LSIB has 4.5 million vertices in it, right? It's a large data set. And the last release increased that by almost 25%. So it's large and growing. So there's a bunch of QA/QC stuff that we do. And then as Eric will often say, the boundary lines themselves are the kind of final product. There is an element in boundary analysis, which is the show your work. How did you get to those lines? And I mentioned in the starting slides a thing called BASE, the Boundaries and Sovereignty Encyclopedia. So BASE is kind of our version of the show your work. So it's a wiki with links to all the source documents and the analysis and the news and all the relevant pieces. So that's open to anybody with a .gov or .mil email address and provides more distilled insight into how those lines came to be. And then in terms of data security, one of the things as we've been upgrading this process, one of the simple things we've done, when you download either the LSIB or the World Polygon zip file, in that folder, you will find a separate file with a 256-bit hash in it, meaning you can compare the download that you get, hash it on your side, and just ensure that what you downloaded was what we intended that data set to be. So if there was any malice, either network bombed out accident, or if for whatever reason someone was trying to modify the data set, we've at least provided that hash for you to ensure that you've got the copy of the lines that we intended to go out.
All right, and actually I'm gonna go to a question I got asked at lunchtime today. We all, you guys are talking about all these data sets, where to get them from, but no one actually really says, where can you actually get this data from, right? Like, where's the data? Like you said, your thing. So if you guys could just list the URL of the places where your data, some of your open data is located at. I know somebody was like, I got asked that question at lunchtime today, so I figured it'd be a good question to ask. So I'll start with you, Josh.
geodata.state.gov.
Write it down, write it down, write it down.
Data.census.gov or census.gov/IDB.
IDB.
Coast.NOAA, that's NOAA, not NOAH, .gov /data viewer.
No.
I feel like I'm going to get this wrong now that you put me on the spot. But I'm fairly certain it's tnm.usgs.gov.
All right. We believe you. Somebody's going to raise their hand like, no, that wasn't it.
Yeah, I could be wrong.
No, now let's go. You guys, now let's move into crowdsource. We talked now, let's kind of define what it is, right? And I think, I'm going to go, Tom, you kind of started off, talked about it a little bit, talking about with the census, you do the survey and stuff like that. Just looking for some of you guys, changing question just a little bit than what we would ask. But when you guys do use crowdsource, what QA, QC checks, you kind of talked about it a little bit. What do you guys use, what do you guys do to check that crowdsource data that you guys bring in before you say we can use it? So whatever best practices are, if you don't, that's okay too. But I just want to just see some of your best practices when you do use crowdsource data.
Yeah, when we get contributed data, which I classify as crowdsource, it goes through the same data validation process that we do with every other data set that we receive. It's highly critiqued with visual inspections, automated reviews, and we kind of have our own crowdsourced version of a vertical accuracy database full of checkpoints. With a contracted job, the contractor will provide us with some manually surveyed checkpoints that we can validate against, but with contributed data, we may not have those. So we kind of have an internal crowdsourced database of checkpoints from the various contracts that we've worked, and we use those to evaluate when needed.
It depends a lot on what is being crowdsourced. So the Weather Service, their cooperative network, cooperative observers, their weather stations get inspected twice a year, once or twice. So, and they get training and all that. So they've gone through a process to sort of show that they're providing good data. Other things like the crowdsourced bathymetry, they might not have done anything. They just supplied that information. That information goes into the database, but might not make it into the charts. However, they just released the standard ocean mapping protocol, I think yesterday, that gives guidance to someone on how they should be doing those measurements. And if they follow those procedures then and document it, then the chances of that data being used in official products is much higher. So there's processes like that in place, and it all depends on what the thing is. I can imagine that, and again, I'm imagining, I don't know this, but something like the ground precipitation, they would probably use a statistical analysis. You know, if there's a lot of people reporting the same kind of precipitation on the ground, that's probably believable. If it's just one person and everyone else is saying it's different, then that has less reliability.
Well, I'll speak again from like a survey perspective. So when people respond to a survey, they will potentially, whether it's a sample survey like the American Community Survey or other household survey that's, say 1%, 2%, whatever sample of the population, or a 100% survey, which we call a census, people will respond completely or incompletely, or perhaps, depending on how the question is worded, may not respond in the way that you're expecting them to. So, there was a question asked earlier, have you not heard of, who has not heard of this data set, or who has not heard of, X, Y, or Z? But if you spin around and say, who has heard of this, I would have been interested to see, what the difference in the hand raising would have resulted in. So, when survey responses come in, they are edited and, before tabulating, either to fill in incomplete data or to resolve nonsensical data. For instance, if somebody reports that they're 130 years old and that they have 2 children who are 150, 160 years old, that is nonsensical or outside the realm of possibility. Some of that can be caught with at the instrument itself when people are responding by putting checks, either hard checks or soft checks in the questionnaire that discourage or prevent people from entering certain responses, or it's handled in the back office, as it were, once the data are being compiled and pulled together. And then when working with tabulated data, so like once the data, all those individual respondents' data has been compiled up and put out in these beautiful products, sorry, Budu, by saying the word product, on the National Statistical Office website, then it's possible that there are underlying issues in the data, especially in countries where statistical capacity may be lower, just because there are fewer resources to direct at data quality checks and things like that. So you'll see phenomenon such as age heaping in the population, where people round their age to the nearest 0 or 5 because the vital statistics system in that country is incomplete. So a large percentage of the population doesn't have a birth certificate, so they don't know the exact date they were born, so they round. Or they just round because it's an easier mental device. So there are many, many checks when it comes to dealing with. This isn't quite crowdsourcing data as we may think of it, but that's how statistical agencies crowdsource is through a survey.
Yeah, I think from the boundary perspective, it's odd to say, oh, we're crowdsourcing boundaries, but particularly as in OSM, the boundaries are locked for good reason. But there is a small crowd of people who contribute information. and send stuff in. And to my knowledge, although Lee and Eric might have more interesting stories, like most of what I had seen as user contributions were things that actually pointed to some other source document. Oh, hey, here's this map, or hey, here's this data set that was published by a national agency, or here's this thing that you could actually kind of independently validate that would kind of just fall into that whole recovery process and the art and science of the boundary recovery that the analyst has. Previously at State, we ran a project called MapGive, where we were trying to catalyze additional mapping into OpenStreetMap. And in that case, you know, we were certainly interested in the veracity of the data that the crowd was producing, but not trying to direct or control in any real way. We just catalyze additional mapping efforts. And working with HOT, this notion of data accuracy in OSM is massive, and at this point, with the amount of corporate interest, you know, we now see things like the Overture Foundation who are taking this even farther and farther. So at the time, what we did was rely on the existing kind of multiple sets of eyeballs approach that the validation tool inside the HOT Tasking Manager was deploying there, just to try to have some element of multiple people looking at the data. And at least with OSM, you know, it was designed to only map things that you could see, so there should be some natural arc towards truth given a number of eyeballs. But this question is pretty fundamental to either the GI science side of this or the standards side of this. And this is a little bit of a soapbox for me, but when you think about it, our metadata structures are completely lacking for a world in which we have heterogeneous data sources. We describe metadata at the data set level. We have no, and if I'm wrong, please come tell me, but there is no OGC standard for feature level metadata. And until we have that, we will be unable to actually have a geographic feature that is originated from some source and evolved over time from multiple sources and be able to put Humpty Dumpty back together again. OSM has a versioning system that might be an approach, but the ability to encode that systematically, to interrogate it via machine and not human, all of that is missing pieces. And I think this is, I've been saying for a long time that I think OGC and the broader geospatial standards community really needs to get after thinking about this. And particularly, we're going to see it. I mean, Maggie said earlier, how many building footprint data sets do we need? My answer would be, which one's right? And maybe it's a little bit of each one. Maybe this one knows what kind of roof tiles are on that thing better than this other one. And so the Frankenstein of data sets that come out to create the one best entity, we can't unpack that. And that's going to be a problem, and it's going to be a bigger problem the more this data gets slurped into ML and AI black boxes where we don't know what's coming out the other side. So I would leave that as a challenge to our profession, that we need to start thinking about how we're going to do this.
I don't know where to go after that. I don't know. Is Josh still in the room? Fix that, Josh, wherever Josh is at.
Aaron, could I say one more thing?
Yeah, go ahead.
Just on that point of, you know, how many building footprint data sets do we need? And I would take the opposite approach to say, not of Josh, but say as many as the market or the geospatial data community wants to produce, because each one has a specific use case, specific purpose, or set of biases. One thing that concerns me with only having one source of information on anything is an echo chamber. In that if we accept X data set is the truth, then there is no alternative. If we suddenly realize, wait, there's a problem with the underlying methodology or whatever. So I think I'm generally agreeing with you that I think it's good for us to have many building footprints.
And I would add about on the metadata side of that I have seen efforts to do spatial metadata, particularly just looking at when digital elevation models are made. So you get spatial metadata that shows what were the sources that went into making up that compiled source. So I think you're right, the standards are missing, but people are trying to do it.
At the pixel level?
You could, yeah, then derive it, like it'd be shapefiles, so you know at the pixel level you would have the area. So yes, you would be able to do that.
All right. So we're going to move on to more of the geospatial solutions now. And just for everybody, we're gonna get some Q&A in a minute, so if you got some questions, please get them ready to go. Going to geospatial solutions that are, how, every agent, I know there's some solutions that when I first started working with the agencies I was working with, there were all these geospatial solutions that came in and then they kind of went away. They're like, we don't like these. It's not, we don't have license. We don't have this. We don't have support. And they kind of went away. So how is the adoption of open source solutions going in your agencies? And what are the big roadblocks or issues or obstacles that are preventing them for greater adoption? And I'll go Tom on first on this.
Well, the Census Bureau has recently adopted an open source first policy. So basically, it's not to say that any proprietary software, proprietary solution is bad or wrong or inferior, but that open source and proprietary solutions should be on a level playing field. And that if there is a solution that we can implement technologically that will manage whatever data issue or challenge that we're facing, and open source software will solve it, then we should go with that route, because we're still going to be paying a large amount of money in customizing it for our specific applications, but we're not adding on top of that the licensing costs. Additionally, open source software are open and transparent, so it makes it easier for us, depending on the specific application, to just open source the methodology. So for instance, I was spending a good deal of time a few minutes ago talking about disclosure avoidance. Our disclosure avoidance system, as it was used for the 2020 census, is extremely complicated and time consuming, but it's open source. It's all written in open source languages. I think it's Python. I can't remember exactly which, but it's posted on the Census Bureau's GitHub account. So you, the rhetorical you, can at least see exactly what we are doing when we implemented the disclosure avoidance system. So I think that I don't want to say it's a new day per se, but there is a great enthusiasm amongst not just the staff level, but at senior leadership of the Census Bureau to adopt free and open source software for geospatial or other applications.
Andrew?
We've been using open source for quite a while, particularly on 3DEP. At this point, our product generation system for 3DEP is entirely open source, and our data validation is probably even split between commercial and open source. But the biggest benefit that we've seen is the scalability that we can accomplish with open source. We moved our product generation system from a desktop plugin with commercial software to a containerized, highly scalable, deployed application that utilizes Django, Celery, RabbitMQ, PostGIS, all of the fun stuff to run on a Kubernetes cluster, so we can scale up the amount of work that we're doing by whatever resources we need or have available.
Kurt?
I think it depends a lot on the team you're talking about. So when I started building our custom solution 25 years ago, we were the red-headed stepchild. We were not going to get a license. So we built it open source, and that worked great. And there have been times in the evolution that there has been commercial software that has come in, and then there's also been times where getting that license has become a problem and it's been ripped back out. So that little small project, open source, no problem. If you're talking about switching open source for a GUI GIS that your entire agency uses and is used to, that's an obstacle. That's going to be tough. So it all depends on what exact problem you're talking about.
Yeah, I've got thoughts, lots of thoughts on that. There's several recursive kind of like intersections to answering this question. We found open source to be extremely useful in the boundaries production process. Some of the performance benefits were unmatched even by other open source or proprietary solutions. As I said, made the shout out to MapShaper, which does things at speed inside Chrome that will, just make you shake your head as to how slow Q and ARC will do it. But I think there's several issues. So if you have a small group of heroes and extremely talented people, then bring all that deep code in and install it, configure it, run it. I want our US government to be capable of doing said thing. But in many cases, we're not as technically proficient as that, as we need to procure services and software. And so now you're into open source business licenses or business models, which is very tricky. But I would say in the geospatial world, I kind of feel when Boundless was purchased, there's a gap in the service providers or the product providers around open source geospatial inside the United States. In Europe, you can look and there's probably 2 major at least service providers or support providers for open source in every EU country. There's barely one here. And so that's a gap in terms of we don't have an industrial base, which is also a risk to us, that we can support all of this on our own. Now we can bring it in onesie twosies and do it. What limits the desktop GIS side? Software approvals. No one wants to go through the authority to operate. Why we can't centralize this? To some degree, I don't know why CISA or the NSA can't just approve a thing once and drop paperwork. And, it's almost like FedRamping desktop software. It seems like Q should just be installable on every government computer. Someone should just be able to show that that's possible. So, yeah, I guess I'll stop there.
I'll stop there. All right, I have one more question, but we're about to go to the crowd. Not that Eddie guy. Anybody else? Anybody else? Bueller. In the back. On the way back. Gentleman in the back. Somebody got a mic runner? We're not going to pick you, Eddie.
Do you have another question?
No.
Or?
I just wanted to, so like a couple weeks ago, there was this vulnerability in XZUtils. It's like a buried compression library that's underpinning a ton of software out there, open source. And it was just by chance discovered by this engineer at Microsoft. And
Who worked on Postgres?
Yeah, yeah. So just wondering what your opinions are on how to protect against, it looks like it was likely a state actor kind of weaseling their way into the open source code base. And if we're going to go on your point that you just made, make Q installable on every desktop in the federal government, doesn't that open us up to potential vulnerabilities when we have, these core libraries maintained by single software engineer?
Wasn't it in, it was in every piece of software, so.
Right.
But
right.
you reminded me actually of something I was going to say, which is I believe there's an executive order out there that says that all software must have a software bill of materials, or SBOM, an SBOM associated with it, that came out earlier this year. And I have no idea how that's going to actually be implemented. But at least open source would give you just that, right? You would at least, you might not be able to stop the infiltration that happened, but once it did happen, if you understood the Frankenstein that is your installed software, you would know that you had it, and at least you would have a path to mitigation. If you have just black box exe installs, you would never know, right?
Anybody else want to answer that question?
I'll just say, something the Census Bureau has done is contract with a vendor to maintain libraries for, say, Python and R internally. So instead of us, if we want to pull in any sort of package or library from, for either Python or R, instead of going to the public repo for it, we have an internally vetted repo that we can pull in, which all packages have been scanned. But they've been scanned. I'm not technically detailed enough on how they are scanned or what the credentialing process is for saying we bless and all of these packages are safe. But that is one step that has, I would say, accelerated the adoption of open source software in my organization.
All right. Kick it over to Eddie.
Okay, so everybody here who's owned a proprietary software company before, stand up. I'm standing up. Tony Q. Yeah. So I will make to that point, and it's a good point, and it's a great story. If you haven't seen that story about the Postgres engineer who worked for Microsoft who discovered this bug, it's going to be a movie. It was in the New York Times. So we've got time. Anyway, I will say that this probably happens more than you know in proprietary software companies, and they never say. But I did want to go back to, at least metaphorically, Josh, I think the point that you made about the U.S. government investing in OpenStreetMap and using that as an analogy in the open source software thing is something that we really have got to address as a community, because it's like we can't just be users and just use this and without investing in it. And we're using OpenStreetMap, and it's a very shaky foundation that we're not investing in it. And I urge the NGAC and everybody here who's associated with policy and all of you to do something about that. So I'll just, Josh, you brought up the point.
Well, I mean, you referenced Paul's talk from Phos4G North America last fall, which was kind of an opus mic drop of a decade of his stuff. I would encourage anyone to go see that. It'll come back to me. I had another thought. But.
You want to say to that, or okay? I know we have one more question. I think I saw another question. The guy in this. Yeah, I know. One more question. Guy in the striped shirt right there.
Thank you. Darrell Cohen, U.S. Census Bureau. I'm a colleague of Tom. Tom, I do have some questions for you, but we can talk later. Actually, I have a question for Mr. Campbell, and I'll preface my question. Please correct me if I'm wrong here, but my understanding is that the Office of the Geographer is part of, or sort of falls under the umbrella of the U.S. intelligence community, and as such, a lot of your work is classified. So I'm just really curious what you might be able to share with us about, I guess, kind of your data collection efforts, and in particular, what kind of quote-unquote ground truthing or field work you all might be involved in that you can talk about. I'm imagining people, going to the International Court of Justice in The Hague and reviewing copies of treaties. It's just like a black box. So I'm really curious what you can kind of share with us about your work.
To your first point, the Office of the Geographer and Global Issues does sit in the State Department Bureau of Intelligence and Research, which is State Department's IC element. So that part's true. The second part about the majority of the work being classified, not necessarily. The Humanitarian Information Unit works almost solely unclassified, and even a big chunk of GGI works unclassified. So it's not as spooky as you could have described it. The ground truthing, and Eric is actually the one that would be much more versed in answering this, but many of the treaties and these documents, we're not ground truthing the Finland-Sweden line, right? They're negotiating it, they're putting it in a treaty, and they're actually filing it at the UN. So there is an international common repository of stuff that the vast majority of things form the basis of where these determinations come from. Now, in some cases where the legal intent in a treaty would be this line follows the ridge line, or this line follows the middle of the river, right? Those are interpreted things in which certainly like a ridge line designation is completely dependent upon the quality of the digital elevation model that you have, right? And so those get revised over time. The LSIB is a public domain data set. We are highly interested in not trying to shove classified information into it because it goes against the entire point. So, that's where commercial imagery and commercial stereo imagery might be useful for helping delineate very tricky spots. But it's not as if, I'm sure Eric would love to go trounce around the Nepal border and field check it for himself, but that's really not happening.
Hey, and on that, we're going to do a quick. We're going to ask one last question and let you guys say your closing thoughts and say whatever you want to talk about data sets. What do you want everybody to know in closing? So real quick, Josh.
Okay, well, world polygons. Beta release, if something's screwed up, let us know. International boundaries at state.gov. I'm going to make my last pitch to actually be something that I think FGDC and OPM should resolve. and it would do a lot for geospatial information science inside the U.S. government. The work job description of a geographer that's on file with OPM hasn't been updated since 1966. It's beautifully written. It's like one of the best documents I've ever read in terms of like, yeah, that's what a geographer does, except there's no computers in it. There's no remote sensing. There's no statistics. There's no, all of the technical things that makes this happen is missing. And then the newest job description that came out of OPM was for a data scientist. Awesome. It's perfect, except no mention of geospatial. Not one. FGDC, I think, on behalf of the steering committee and its constituent members in the U.S. government, should work with OPM to revise both of those job descriptions to put this stuff in and reinforce the existing interoperability and dissemination requirements that we have for our spatial data. And that would do a lot of like fixing the foundation piece that we could build upon to say, nope, you actually need to know this to do the job.
Okay. Tom?
I have 3 things. 1, if you get a survey from the U.S. Census Bureau, please respond to it. We really appreciate it. 2, it's really hard to estimate the world's population. So if you want to go to census.gov/IDB, you can appreciate the data set and hopefully use it for your purposes. And then 3, if you are into statistics and geography, please check out the Census Bureau, USAjobs.gov. I think that's where all of our job announcements would be posted. So please go there and apply. Thank you.
I'm going to follow up a little bit on the OpenStreetMap thing and say it's a broader issue than just OpenStreetMap, that we need to find ways to fund a lot of these other open source things. GDAL is one that is close to my heart that we need to find a way to contract to give them money, but contracting officers would like to have deliverables, and we really just want this stuff to be better for the common good. They don't tend to like that language. So we need to figure out how do we actually get money to these groups.
I have 2. 1, a continuation on that. I would personally like to be able to take time to contribute to these rather than just funding to them. And 2, if anybody does know that I got that URL wrong, feel free to correct me.
Shameless ploy. If you're in Orlando on Monday, 7:30 in the morning, I'm teaching a QGIS plugging class, so please show up. It's 7:30 in Monday morning. Please, I don't want to be there by myself. And just give a shout out. I see Calvin Hamilton in the audience today. If you guys don't know him in our space, he was the best QGIS developer, GeoServer developer that was there. He's retiring, so thank you for all your service. So thank you very much. And thank you guys, and we'll see you guys later.